Hi, everyone. We're very pleased to welcome today Professor Rosemary Joyce, Professor of Anthropology at UC Berkeley and current Chair of Anthropology Department. Professor Joyce works on the use of imagery and to create and reinforce gendered identities in the classic Maya and the formative period. She conducted fieldwork in northern Honduras from 1977 to 2009, and she also worked and curated collections in several museums in the US and Honduras, which inspired her work on issues of cultural policy and histories of collection. Today, Professor Joyce will be discussing wealth, women's labor, and forms of value, thinking from the study of ancestral Central America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rosemary Joyce.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to join you. It's my real pleasure to have the opportunity to share this work in progress. So, reconsideration of the deep past of contemporary economic relations is enjoying a remarkable moment of public attention. Authors aiming at transdisciplinary or even popular audiences are returning to archaeological data to trace genealogies for the contemporary situation in which we find ourselves. And surely that's a good thing. However, in the process, even archaeologists engaged in these efforts seem routinely to skip the necessary step of critiquing the terms we employ. I seek to contribute to a critique of the way archaeologists, and hence those relying on us, understand and characterize activities and relations as something we might call economic. In this talk, I will do three things. Consider how contemporary writing equating women's activities in something called the household with a non-economic sector. Using materials from Mexico and Central America, I'll attempt to show that the distinction between the household and a presumed economic sector does not hold up, and then link these observations to understandings of standard economic models by contemporary feminist and Marxist feminist critics. My own work questions the use of something that we might think of as an individual as a natural, social, and thus economic unit, and the assumption that a natural category of like-bodied individuals, such as women, exists that transcends different times and places. It's remarkable how little impact work on gender and sexuality by archaeologists has had on the recent literature on ancient economies, however. Instead, authors continue to rely on anthropological assumptions about a natural division of labor based on age and sex that we can trace back to 19th century roots. Fundamental to this primordial naturalization of human categories is a reduction of the female person to a body that is a product of the commodification of labor as part of the development of capitalism. For example, in James C. Scott's Against the Grain, his retelling of the history of the state in Mesopotamia, in-text discussions having to do with women are indexed only under terms that relate women as reproductive bodies or slaves. These two lines of discussion are in fact related by a running argument that states relied on unfree labor, leading to, and I quote, attention to husbanding the subject population, including women, as a form of wealth, like livestock, in which fertility and high rates of reproduction were encouraged, end quote. While offered as part of a general discussion of self-domestication by the human species, the slippage here is telling. It's women's bodies that are domesticated like livestock. Men do not appear in these passages as domesticated animals. Scott, of course, is not an archaeologist. 10,000 Years of Inequality, edited by Tim Kohler and Michael Smith, has a similar synthetic aim and a broader global scope. They frame their core question as understanding the growth of wealth disparities, including their connection to the development of domesticated plants and animals and to increases in sociopolitical scale. Their published volume, like Scott's, does not include gender or sex as index terms. Neither appear in the index. There is one index term for women, mobility and health of, and this leads to an introductory discussion of the origins of social inequality. Here, we are told that in areas where farming developed during the Holocene, reduced mobility improved women's energy balance and decreased interbirth spacing. In the concluding chapter of their work, women reappear in the guise of mothers, freed by use of cow and goat milk to, and I quote, wean their children and resume bearing earlier, end quote. Mostly, the contributors treat the subject of household-level wealth differences without explicit consideration of the varying positions of men and women. But when women appear, they appear as producers of children. Smith and Kohler depart from the same assumption Scott employs, that women are primarily active as embodied sources of children, always encompassed by a family structure in which the only active political and thus economic agency is that of men. Yet, even in the societies under examination by these authors, the claim that women are economic only as tools for the agency of men is questionable. A common tendency is to treat as exceptions those women who form part of political leadership or who are recorded as independently owning property or having authority. Even more troubling than this kind of exceptionalism, in which individual women count as quasi-men, is the systematic and usually inexplicit assumption that women's efforts were normally not recognized to their own credit. Appropriation of labor is treated as a given. In the archaeology of the region where I work, Central America, this leads to claims that even the well-documented roles women had in producing textiles that formed the key political valuable, a standard of exchange, and a medium of tribute in hierarchical political organizations, involved no social credit to the women involved. What I want to do in the next section of this paper is use this case to begin to rethink how we might avoid the naturalizations of heteronormativity, individuality, patriarchy, and labor appropriation that so much archaeology simply treats as natural. Much of Central America is discussed by archaeologists as a single culture area, Mesoamerica. To the extent that this is defensible, it reflects histories that resulted in a linked network of politically administered societies. As defined, all the societies recognized as Mesoamerican were primarily reliant on agriculture for their economic basis. For my purposes, one of the most significant things about this network of societies is the long-term use of a small number of items as valuables, fostered by and fostering the integration of relations recognized by analysts as an economy. Some scholars have even employed Emanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory as a model for Mesoamerica, especially at the moments when the most extensive empires were active, centered on two successively occupied cities in central Mexico, Teotihuacan and Tenochtitlan. Conceived of as a world system, Mesoamerica is a political economy in which a small urban elite in central Mexico extracted surplus raw materials for use in manufacturing in the core, where labor increased the value of these materials extracted from its periphery, which included the entire Maya lowlands. Indeed, in my own doctoral dissertation, I discussed the Ulúa Valley, where I worked, precisely as a periphery of a dendritic economy, a periphery from which more urbanized areas to the west extracted new materials. With the benefit of more than 30 years to reconsider this, I find it fails to explain what is interesting about this case. It does not account for the most historically interesting thing about the transactions recognized as economic in this network of societies, the unusual nature of the basic media of exchange and standards of value, which are perishable organic materials, notably cacao, the source of chocolate, and cotton cloth. In the Mesoamerican economy is famously where, as Renee Millen put it, money grew on trees in the form of the seeds extracted from cacao pods. These were recorded by Spanish sources as being used for payments to political leaders. The Mesoamerican economy, especially in its most hierarchical tribute states and empires, used a second organic material, cotton, as another standard of value in the form of cotton cloth. I argue that these materials became media and standards of value due to their embedding in specific forms of social relations. Starting with these two perishable goods, unusual choices globally for economic exchange media, I have argued previously that all of the known media of standards of value in Mesoamerica have to be understood in terms of the social practices that gave them meaning and thus value for specific groups of people. Cotton cloth played a particularly important role as a concentrated index of work, sometimes but not always very skilled work, undertaken by groups of people who lived together and formed what archaeologists recognize as households. Cacao drinks were broadly used in transactions between groups of humans and supernatural beings as a powerful ritual substance. Both cacao and cotton were exchanged when new social alliances were formed. The special role of cotton cloth as tribute payment has been recognized for as long as scholars have developed arguments about the Mesoamerican economy. In 16th century Mexico, Spanish administrators authorized the production of a register of tribute payments owed to the Mexica, the Aztec Empire, centered in Tenochtitlan, which they sought to replace and whose tribute they sought to continue to receive. This was tribute owed by towns. Entry after entry in these books detailed tribute paid in specific numbers of mantas, lengths of cloth woven on backstrap looms. Some towns were listed as providing more elaborate cloth, ornamented through additional techniques, such as resist dyeing. While credited as payments of the town, all of this cloth was the product of normative women's work, in which young girls were trained by elder women, carried out within the house and courtyards of residences. Not only was the importance of cloth and its implication of demands on women's labor unique to the late, nor was this unique to the late conquest empire created by the Mexica. The same was true of the city-states of Maya people, occupied 5 centuries or more earlier in Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. Images and texts from this literate society identify cloth as a major tribute good. In this example of a vessel, cloth rendered to the ruler of a city-state by lords of subordinate towns. Archaeological analyses parallel the historical information derived from texts and indicate that cloth production was a visible activity of women in the ruling families. Tools for spinning and weaving cloth form part of many excavated assemblages. Spindle whorls, bone weaving battens, and bone weaving picks are recorded when archaeologists in the region carry out excavations in places like the small-scale settings of everyday face-to-face life, house compounds. But they are not found everywhere and not in the same abundance or with the same degree of elaboration. Indeed, whole secondary industries produced enhanced tools discarded preferentially around the houses of the apparent ruling and noble families. While cloth produced with these tools generally does not survive in the tropical environment, the carefully crafted tools not only place production as a key medium of the economy in what was considered the domestic sphere, they underline the social importance of cloth making, served by secondary artisanal crafting to produce elaborate tools. 2 ways of thinking about these patterns have emerged. On one side are apparently common sense claims that women's work was appropriated by men, men of their families, men of the state, men of the empire, without any credit to the crafting women. In this view, strongly influenced by anthropological naturalization of sex-based hierarchies, women become a kind of captive force working against their will only to lose the products of their labor. Even for the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, however, there are other potential implications of cloth production. First, the tribute-owing unit was not an individual, but the community. While cloth extracted from towns became anonymous in the markets of Tenochtitlan, alienated from its producers, where the Mexica nobility converted it to other goods. In the towns where the work of cloth production took place, weaving and spinning would have been visibly associated with known persons, recognized for their skill and expertise, what anthropologist Julia Hendon describes as their craft knowledge. Indeed, in texts, Spanish-trained clerics recorded using the European alphabet to transcribe the indigenous Nahuatl language. Spinning and weaving are described as valued activities through which the subjective skill and personality of women are celebrated. The specific texts we have come from informants who were part of the ruling nobility and merchant guild. They characterized the epitome of womanhood for these classes or segments of society as skilled craft production. They are echoed in the vocabulary for special tribute cloth types recorded for the new Spanish administration, pointing to the legibility of these items as products of skilled women, of skilled crafters. Here, we could consider the analysis of gender scholar Judith Butler, who used Hegel's master and bondsman dialogue, usually employed to indicate the appropriation of the work of the embodied bondsman by the master, instead noting that the bondsman continues to recognize the signs of her work even after the master has re-signed the products of that labor. The recognition of the labor of weavers is evident in the production for some crafters of highly ornamented tools, themselves pointing to significant social support for skilled craft work. I suggest that we need to consider the likelihood that tribute in cloth was more than simply a way for these states to accumulate goods that they would then exchange in the marketplace for other forms of capital. Cloth was substantively connected to groups of women who spun and wove, and to other people of the community who provided the cultivated cotton and tools with which it was worked. The literal emplacement of the backstrap loom, attached normatively to part of the house structure, performatively connects the cloth produced with the people who made a place, a world, to the towns that sent cloth to the cities. And this role was public, visible. The centrality of social relations to the value of cloth in these societies, while sometimes minimized, has been more broadly recognized than the centrality of social relations related to women to the second standard of value to which I now turn, cacao. Where cloth is understood as a specialized currency that circulated as a sign of hierarchy in political relations, cacao has at times been characterized almost as a generalized currency. Yet nothing about the selection and persistence for thousands of years of this organic material as a standard of value suggests that it was understood as a simple medium of exchange, as cash. Cacao seeds are derived from the plants of the genus Theobroma. In archaeological research, including my own research in conjunction with John Henderson of Cornell University, residues of chemicals diagnostic of Theobroma were found in vessels dating to before 1100 BC. In our Honduran research, based on the forms and contexts of the vessels we tested, and the culinary chemistry that transforms raw cacao seeds into dried cacao beans through a necessary stage of fermentation, we have argued that cacao was originally exploited as part of a suite of plants converted into alcoholic beverages used in hospitality on the part of groups at the scale of the household. The addition of ground cacao seeds, as well as other condiments, including chili, vanilla, fruit pits, and flowers, shown in this much later images, known historically from texts and in many images, was part of the elaboration of a cacao cuisine through which different cacao producers could distinguish themselves as hosts in social settings. The fresh preparation of cacao drinks at the point of serving that was necessitated from this cuisine would have allowed the association of the server, like the woman seen here pouring cacao in to raise the froth before it is served, with the event itself, and therefore at least with some of the social credit for the event. Cacao maintains associations of hospitable provisioning, even when it's offered to deities, as in contemporary earth offering ceremonies by the Lenca of Honduras. Contemporary and historic Lenca sources specifically associate the offering of cacao beverages as significant in restoring health to the earth. Descriptions in Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, note that cacao was restricted in consumption, either in ceremony or more generally, by the members of the most exclusive social group, who were themselves treated in many ways as sacred beings. The use of cacao as a measure of value, like the value of cloth, cannot be separated from its social significance in activities, including activities in which women were key participants and visible participants. We might turn to another contemporary synthetic deep history of the domain archaeologists designate as the economy to help and conceptualize this and to think about what it tells us about women's activities, recognized or not, as economic. This is David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Graeber offers a much more dynamic and explicitly revisionist view of the same millennia as Scott, often dealing with the same places. Far from a unified category of women and a second unified category of men, however, in Graeber's work, we see cross-cutting dimensions of age-based authority, property ownership, and activity that distinguish among male and female persons. What makes Graeber more successful at seeing women as complex actors, which is signified, among other things, by a plethora of index entries about women and gender, is, among other things, his critical project, which questions the way a certain set of concepts about the economy have become taken for granted background terms today and underwrite inequality in our modern world. His discussion of the language of debt and credit draws directly from classic works of what were once described as substantivist anthropologies of the economy, such as studies of the differential treatment and circulation of goods among the Tiv of Africa. Graeber emphasizes the views of the Tiv themselves, who call attention to the potential for what he calls a human economy to slide into a market economy. This is the context that Graeber describes in which people of various categories, including women, see their bodily integrity commodified and the social value of their contributions erode. Graeber links the shift from a human economy to a market economy to precisely the reduction of persons to tokens that in naturalized form haunts the other deep histories I have mentioned here. Graeber begins his work on debt from the grounding of his previous anthropological reconsideration of value as it's discussed by Marx. For Marxist feminists in the 1970s and 1980s, the question of women's unwaged work was precisely a question of value, specifically whether in capitalist economies this work had any value, and if so, what kind. Most often, the first generation of these writers concluded that what they then called housework was properly excluded from considerations of labor value. In writing that subsequent scholars harshly criticized as naturalizing not just a specific sexualized position of work, but one that was inherently heterosexist in its imagination of transcultural family life. Feminists who responded critically to these initial formulations sought to rework Marxist formulations to broaden understandings of value so that work in unwaged, everyday settings was understood to be productive of value. This research has had important impacts on broader economic practice and even economic policy, with the realization that women's uncounted work would potentially add up to 50% to the gross domestic product of modern nations if it were quantified. Yet other feminists still saw a danger in trying to treat work that women largely do in domestic or residential settings in the same way that work in factories is described. These critical Marxist feminists call attention to the naturalizing of a specific way of thinking about some practices as the economy, that this perpetuates an approach that is profoundly embedded in precisely the kind of exploitation and alienation of working bodies from which it seeks to emancipate us. Rooted in these critiques, I've tried in this talk to demonstrate that in ancestral Mexico and Central America, Theorizing an economy disembedded from social relations distorts what we know from historical texts and archaeological research. The processes used to support the production of cloth spawned additional crafting of tools that socially foregrounded spinning and weaving, and associated these tools with divine capacities of creation. Cloth production represented the accumulation of efforts by a wide range of social actors, drawing together residents of small rural agricultural settlements, representing themselves in autonomous social relations with tribute towns to which they had to pay tribute. The gendered associations of cloth production then have to be seen as emergent from social relations, not given in nature. There's not simply an appropriation of already alienable bodily labor that we can presume. The gendered associations of cloth production have a history embedded in other forms of growing power and social relations. Examining the associations of textile tools in hundreds of burials in one village occupied between 1000 and 700 BC in central Mexico, Tlatilco, for example, I noted that despite significant evidence for matrilineal kinship joining members of localized houses, textile tools were not restricted to one sex, suggesting that at this early period in Mesoamerican history, the gendered nature, the normative gendered nature of textile production was not yet thematized. When textile production is represented as women's work, beginning with the classic Maya and continuing through the later Mexica and post-classic Maya, it clearly has more significance than simply being what women do. It's one of the ways that some people assumed a gendered, but also always already classed position. In the emergence of cacao seeds as a second tribute good and a measure of value, again, it's social relations and meanings, not scarcity or inherent value, that made cacao worthwhile. Cacao served to visitors in small-scale encounters, presented to supernatural beings responsible for the health of the earth, and more routinely consumed by human leaders who claimed a divine-like standing, was the material for performances of social provisioning and hospitality that marked food preparation as something more than the natural role of all women or a private concern outside of the economy. For the societies of ancient Central America, such a division simply did not exist. Not only did a large part of the organization of agricultural labor build on household structures, women's specialist craft production in residential locales, in particular, was critical to broader social, political, and hence economic relations. In these societies, cloth production by women working in domestic spaces was one of the enduring standards of value, specifically important in tribute payments that established and perpetuated political hierarchies. Cloth's role in this fashion cannot be disentangled from the social relations in which it was embedded, nor can the social relations which gave value to other key media used to measure value in economic exchanges, for example, in the cultivation, preparation, and consumption of cacao, a second standard of value. By considering these two media and the way that they relate to women's economic activities, extending from residential spaces to cosmopolitan marketplaces, I seek not only a better understanding of the economic relations in these pre-Hispanic societies, but a more nuanced way of thinking about women's participation in activities that should count in modern economies as well. Thank you very much.